Lizzie Borden, middle of page 192. Day 8, Tuesday, June 13th, 1893. Things were getting gruesome. The pillow shams and bedspreads speckled with Miss Borden's blood had been draped over the rail of the jury box the day before. Crime scene photographs, stained pieces of woodwork, dresser-top marble, and blood-stiffened carpeting all made vivid appearances. It was literally sickening. Governor Robinson had to fan Lizzie as medical examiner Dolan gave his painstaking recital of each blood spatter and wound, showing on a pair of plaster heads where each whack of the hatchet had fallen. The heat did not help. A quick smattering of rain on the 8th morning brought no relief, leaving the air moist as breath as Dr. Dolan continued his grisly testimony. It boiled down to these 4 points. The blows to both victims could have been inflicted by a woman of ordinary strength using a sharp cutting instrument with the leverage of a handle. Furthermore, Dr. Dolan believed the assailant had stood over and astride Miss Borden, that is, with one foot on either side of her body. The significance is all but lost to us now, but in 1892, that a thought of a woman standing this way was ludicrous. Women did not ever part their knees to ride horseback. Only a man, it was thought, would straddle his victim. Dr. Borden's assailant had likely stood behind him at the head of the sofa and chopped downward. The slashes on the Borden skulls ranged from half an inch to 5 inches long, making it impossible for Dolan to single out any of the hatchets found on the Borden property as the murder weapon. Although the chipped edges of some of the cuts in Mr. Borden's skull suggested the blows had fallen from left to right, indicating a left-handed murderer, Dolan decided that the angled position of Mr. Borden's head was the true cause of the left-to-right beveling, and the blows were most likely struck straight on. It was almost too much for one juror. Shortly after, Dr. Dolan pantomimed the blow to Miss Borden's back on one of the stenographers. 59-year-old Lewis Hodges grew faint. His distress earned the jury a 5-minute recess. The horror show had only just begun. Dr. Draper, medical examiner of Suffolk County, was still to testify. At first, it was all the same: measurements, skin flaps, bone chips. And then District Attorney Knowlton asked whether there was anything in the nature of character of the wounds that would help the doctor determine the size of the weapon. There was, Dr. Draper said, on the head of Mr. Borden. Would the skull itself be of assistance to pointing out such things as occur to you to be important? It would. Then in that case, although I regret very much the necessity of doing it, Knowlton said, I shall have to ask Dr. Dolan to produce it. The attorney and justices conferred for a moment. Then Justice Mason quietly announced that Lizzie Borden would be excused from the room during the display. The New York Tribune considered it to be an act of genuine mercy. All morning long, Lizzie Borden sat with red eyes and trembling lips, and with deep marks in her pale face, looking as long as she could, listening as much as she could, and finally retreating in grief and tears behind her fan. Then in came the skull of Andrew J. Borden, done up in a white handkerchief, one reporter wrote, and looked like a bouquet, such as a man carries to his sweetheart. The murder weapon's blade, Dr. Draper believed, measured 3 1/2 inches, exactly the size of the hoodoo hatchet. Will you tell us what it is that leads you to that conclusion? Draper produced a little plate of tin, cut to 3 1/2 inches, and fitted it into the first one. Then another of fatal gashes on Mr. Borden's skull. Are you able to say whether the hatchet's head, Knowlton said, displaying the hoodoo hatchet, is capable of making those wounds? I believe it is. Have you attempted to fit that in the wounds? I have seen the attempt made. Will you do it yourself? I will try. Dr. Draper lowered the little blade straight down into Mr. Borden's skull. It fit. The handless hatchet is not an uncommon instrument, is it? Colonel Adams asked on cross-examination. No, sir, Dr. Draper said. I think it was a very general circulation. I think so. Adams produced a brand new hatchet displayed, still glinting with gilt. Is there anything about that is out of the ordinary? Nothing that I perceive at present, sir. Won't you see if you can cut that into the injury or the scar on the skull? Adams asked. His intent was clear. If that ordinary hatchet fit Mr. Borden's skull, so might any other hatchet from any other cellar or hardware store. The doctor touched the metal to the bone. It does not fit the wound, he announced. The blade had not been ground down enough, Draper explained. The corners were too blunt to penetrate the skull. There was just one problem with Dr. Draper's dramatic demonstration. There was no blood on the hoodoo hatchet, not one microscopic speck. Professor Wood had tested scrapings from the blade to make sure no blood was mixed with the iron rust. He had pried the wooden handle stub from the iron eye and soaked it for days in a solution of potassium iodide to determine whether any blood had seeped into the crevice between the handle and the head. The solution remained clean. The wooden stump, Wood said, had been free of dust when he received it. Whether the sediment on the blade was ash, he could not say. But in spite of all the handling and rubbing in his laboratory in the courtroom, traces of the peculiar white dust remained embedded in the hoodoo hatchet's rusty cavities. The material might adhere that way, Wood guessed, if the hatchet had been wet when it came in contact with the stuff. If the hatchet had inflicted such wounds as were found on Mr. and Miss Borden's skulls, District Attorney Knowlton wanted to know how it could be washed clean. Colonel Adams objected. He may answer, Justice Mason ruled. Before the handle was broken, not after, Wood said. Why do you make the difference, Professor? Knowlton asked, while Adams continued to object to no avail. Because it would be very hard to wash blood off that broken end, Professor Wood said. A little louder, Knowlton prodded. It would be almost impossible to quickly wash blood out of that broken end. It might have been done by thoroughly cleansing, but that would also stain the fracture. It could be done. But could Lizzie Borden, could anyone, have washed that hatchet so thoroughly and so quickly? Day 9, Wednesday, June 14th, 1893. District Attorney Knowlton's case was closing in on Lizzie Borden. Marshal Hilliard and Mayor Coughlin told the jury of Lizzie's surprising response to be informed she was a suspect. I am ready to go at any time. Cloakmaker Hannah Gifford swore she had heard Lizzie refer to Miss Borden as a mean, good-for-nothing thing, now adding the detail that she had inadvertently triggered Lizzie's outburst by referring to Miss Borden as mother. When the prosecution called a set of 6 witnesses to eliminate possible escape routes for the scene of the crime, next door to the north, Miss Churchill's boarder, Thomas Bowles, was washing a carriage at the end of the driveway where he could look across Miss Churchill's yard and see the Borden's wall house. Directly behind the Churchill lot, a young French girl named Lucy Colette spent an hour sitting out in front of Dr. Chagon's house at the northeast end of the doctor's big double lot. To her right lay the Chagon orchard, which bordered the back of the Borden's property. The Chagon's neighbor to the north, Miss Aubrey Kirby, was at work in her kitchen all morning, where she had a view of the passage leading to Dr. Chagon's barn. She remembered looking out the window around 11:30. South of the Chagon's orchard, in the Crow yard, kitty-corner to the Bordens, 2 laborers, Joseph DeRoser and John Denny, worked all morning long sawing wood and cutting stone. Sometime between 10:10 and 10:30, a 3rd laborer named Patrick McGowan climbed a sawhorse in Crow's yard and leaned right up over the Borden's fence to snatch a few ripe pears from the tree. Not one of them saw anybody enter or leave the Borden property, or anyone cutting through the adjoining yards. Oddly enough, that was good news for Lizzie Borden. Deputy Sheriff Francis Wixon had climbed to the Borden lumber pile and gotten himself up onto the top rail of the 6-foot barbed wire top fence at the back of the Borden's yard between 11:45 and noon that day. He shimmied along the whole length of the fence rail before jumping down onto Crow's lumber pile, completely unnoticed until he spoke to Dr. Rossier. Escaping over the fence would be a gamble for any killer, not knowing who was nearby and which way they might be looking. But if Deputy Wixon had done it, couldn't a murderer? No one had forgotten the newspaper story of the quarrel Matron Reagan had overheard between Lizzie and Emma Borden, and all the hullabaloo that had followed. How their matron at first contradicted the papers, then refused, by order of the city marshal, to sign her name to an official denial. If she had witness to say about it, Marshal Hilliard had ordered her. The witness stand was the place for it. Now Matron Hannah Reagan stood in the witness box, ready to testify for the government. Now will you go on and describe in your own way what occurred after Miss Emma came? Mr. Moody asked. The time that elapsed and all that was said and done. With notable zeal and encyclopedic detail, Matron Reagan recited the whole story. From the moment Emma arrived in Lizzie's cell at 8:40 until Lawyer Jennings came in over 2 hours later, just as the papers had printed it. Lawyer Jennings rose to cross-examine her. Lawyer Jennings, whose arrival that day had supposedly interrupted the sisters' stony silence, followed their quarrel. "Did Miss Emma come again that day?" Jennings asked. "In the afternoon, sir." "What time did she come in the afternoon?" "I never kept the time of when she came. She came at all hours of the day." She could not have left Jennings a better opening. "You say she came at 20 minutes of 9 that morning, and now, when I ask you what time she came in the afternoon, you say you didn't keep the time?" Matron Reagan's testimony began to quake beneath her. She could not say what time Emma had come that afternoon, or who else had been there. Only that there had been lots of visitors. Reverend Buck was one, she said. "Are you sure he came that same afternoon?" Jennings asked. "Well, I know we had visitors that afternoon. I think Mr. Buck came." "Well, how sure are you of that?" "Well, he came every day," she explained. "There wasn't a day while Miss Borden was there that he hadn't come to the Central Police Station." "How do you know he didn't come in the morning?" "No, he didn't come in that time in the morning." "Are you sure he came in the afternoon?" Perhaps Jennings was only bluffing. "If he was, it paid off. I couldn't say about it," Matron Reagan said. "Have you any recollection about it?" "No," she said. "I was taken away with this trouble so much that it upset me, Mr. Jennings. The sisters' quarrel so disturbed her. She claimed that she could not remember at all what happened in the afternoon." "Now let me go a little further and see if I can refresh your recollection," Jennings offered. "Don't you remember that Miss Holmes was there that afternoon, and you had some conversation about an egg?" She did indeed. Matron Reagan told all about the afternoon with the egg. The whole amusing conversation, right down to who was sitting where. "Had quite a pleasant time all afternoon, didn't you?" Jennings remarked. "The day of the breaking of the egg we did, laughed and talked," the matron said. "Well, the afternoon of the breaking of the egg, you weren't very much disturbed, were you?" "No, sir." He had set a trap, and the matron had fallen in. She knew it, and she could not hide it. Jennings could not resist driving the point further yet. "Had quite a pleasant afternoon that afternoon, didn't you?" "Well, I don't know it was very pleasant," she retorted. "Not to me." Matron Reagan had backed herself into an awful corner. If Jennings undermined her credibility enough to make it appear that she had lied to the papers about the quarrel, she would likely lose her job. But if, by changing her story, she perjured herself before the Superior Court of Bristol County, she would fear no better. "Wasn't that afternoon the egg episode about as pleasant as an afternoon you had while Miss Lizzie was there?" Jennings pressed. "I can't answer that," Matron Reagan said. As far as the defense was concerned, she already had. Lizzie Borden sat forward in her chair and glared at Eli Benz as he took the stand. The directness of her gaze so unnerved the young druggist that he blushed and stammered. "I do," before the clerk of the court finished reciting the oath. Mr. Benz answered only 8 questions before Governor Robinson interrupted. The defense had no intention of letting the druggist tell the jury about the woman who attempted to buy poison from him on August 3rd. They would not even be allowed to hear the lawyers argue the point, and were sent from the room before the words prussic acid were uttered. Without a prescription, Mr. Moody contended there was no practical use for prussic acid. Anyone asking for it over the counter must have a sinister purpose in mind, and Eli Benz's testimony would prove that Lizzie Borden had made such an attempt. "You propose to bring evidence upon attempts, but not success?" Governor Robinson asked. "Yes, sir," Knowlton said. Robinson balked. "She is charged in the indictment with slaying or killing these 2 people with a sharp instrument, committing the murder with an axe, for instance, nothing else. Poison had nothing to do with Andrew and Abby Borden's death. Professor Wood's testimony had proven that. A failed attempt to buy prussic acid was lean evidence as far as Robinson was concerned. Moody argued it showed premeditation, proving that Lizzie Borden was in a murderous state of mind on the 3rd of August. I conceive of no more significant act, he concluded, nothing which tends to show more the purpose of doing mischief to someone than the attempt to obtain one of the most deadly poisons that is known to humankind at the present time. Governor Robinson insisted that the simple act of asking a druggist for prussic acid proved nothing, especially when Lizzie Borden had shown no prior indication of violence towards her parents, towards anyone at all. For that matter, a statement of intent, Robinson argued, was a critical element in the cases Moody had cited. But there is nothing of that, Robinson pointed out. It is entirely absent. As for the poison itself, Robinson shrugged it off as a little consequence. Well, people buy prussic acid to kill animals, and maybe the cat. That is innocent. It is not a crime, at any rate. The court agreed. Eli Benz's testimony was excluded.